Hey, welcome back to the show, and a big thank you for tuning in once again.
As always, we've got a glossary waiting for you in the description, so if any word catches you off guard, it's right there.
All right, let's dive in.
Jake, I want to start with something that has been on my mind for a while. I was reading about climate change last week. The wildfires, the rising sea levels, the record temperatures, and I felt genuinely overwhelmed. Like, what am I actually supposed to do with that information?
I know that feeling very well. Climate anxiety, I think they call it now. The gap between the scale of the problem and what any individual can realistically do about it. It is a genuinely difficult place to sit.
Exactly. And I find that sometimes when something feels too big, the temptation is to just switch off entirely. Like, if I can't fix it, why think about it at all?
Which is understandable, but also kind of dangerous, because that's exactly the mentality that allows inaction to continue. If everyone thinks their contribution is too small to matter, then collectively nothing changes.
Right. So today I want to explore this properly. Not in a preachy or guilt trip kind of way. I really cannot stand that approach to climate communication, but in an honest, realistic way. What can one person actually do? And does it actually make a difference?
I love that framing, because I think the conversation around individual action in climate change has become quite polarized. On one side, you have people who say, every little helps, change your habits, be the change. On the other side, you have people who say individual actions are a distraction. It's all about systemic change. The corporations are responsible. And honestly, I think both sides have a point.
So do I. Let's try and hold both ideas at the same time and see where that takes us.
I want to start with something that might surprise you. Do you know where the concept of the carbon footprint actually comes from?
I assume it came from environmental scientists or researchers?
That's what most people assume. But it was actually popularized by BP, British Petroleum, as part of a major advertising campaign in the early 2000s. They even created an online carbon footprint calculator that put the responsibility for emissions squarely on individual consumers.
Seriously? That is genuinely shocking. So one of the world's largest oil companies essentially invented the idea that climate change is your personal fault?
More or less, yes. The strategy was brilliant from their perspective. By shifting the focus to what individuals eat, drive, and buy, the conversation moved away from the structural decisions being made by corporations and governments. It's a classic deflection tactic.
And it worked incredibly well, because now most people automatically think about climate change in terms of their own behavior. Should I take fewer flights? Should I go vegan? Should I buy an electric car? Rather than asking, why does my energy company still rely on fossil fuels? Or why does my government continue to subsidize the oil industry?
Exactly. And I think it's important to be aware of that framing before we talk about individual action, because it helps us put it in perspective. Individual choices do matter, but they matter most when they happen alongside systemic pressure, not instead of it.
So individual action is necessary, but not sufficient. It's part of the picture, not the whole picture.
That is a really clean way to put it. Necessary, but not sufficient.
Okay, so let's talk about impact, because not all individual actions are created equal, and I think a lot of people waste energy feeling guilty about the wrong things.
What do you mean?
Well, a lot of the standard advice around individual climate action focuses on things like turning off lights when you leave a room, bringing a reusable bag to the supermarket, or taking shorter showers. And these things are fine. They're good habits, but their actual impact on your carbon emissions is pretty minimal.
So what are the high-impact actions?
The research is pretty consistent on this. The 3 individual decisions with the highest climate impact are having 1 fewer child, living car-free, and avoiding flying, particularly long-haul flights. After those, eating a plant-based or predominantly plant-based diet comes 4th.
Those are all significant lifestyle changes, though, not small adjustments.
They are, and that's kind of the point. The things that would genuinely move the needle are also the things that feel most personal and most difficult to change, which is exactly why they tend to get left out of mainstream climate messaging.
I want to push back slightly on the aviation one, actually, because there's a class dimension to this that I think is important. Telling people not to fly assumes that flying is a lifestyle choice for everyone, but for a lot of people, immigrants, people with family on other continents, people whose entire professional network is abroad, it is not really a choice in the same way.
That is a completely fair point. And I think it speaks to a wider issue with how we discuss climate action, which is that it often gets framed as if everyone starts from the same position. The carbon footprint of a billionaire taking a private jet is not remotely comparable to a nurse flying home to see her family once a year. They cannot be treated as equivalent moral choices.
Right, which is another reason why systemic change, making clean options the default rather than the premium option, is ultimately more powerful than individual behavior change.
If the train were cheaper than the plane, most people would take the train.
Exactly. The problem is not that people don't care, it's that the system is set up to make the worst choice easier and more affordable.
I want to bring in something that I think gets underestimated in this conversation, which is the social dimension of individual action. Because your choices don't just affect your personal carbon footprint, they also influence the people around you.
The ripple effect.
Exactly. There's actually research showing that when someone in a social group makes a visible, sustainable choice, buys an electric car, installs solar panels, stops eating meat, it meaningfully increases the likelihood that people close to them will make the same change. Behavior is socially contagious in a way that is hard to quantify, but genuinely significant.
So your individual action is never truly individual. It is always also a form of social signaling and norm shifting.
Right. And I think this is one reason why the individual action is pointless argument can be taken too far. Yes, one person changing their diet does not fix the climate. But one person changing their diet and talking about it and making it look normal and achievable, that has a different kind of value.
There is also a psychological case for individual action that I find quite compelling. When you feel like you are doing something, anything, your sense of helplessness decreases. And when you feel less helpless, you are actually more likely to engage in bigger forms of action, like voting, campaigning, or pressuring companies and politicians.
So individual action as a gateway to collective action, rather than a substitute for it.
Precisely. The two things can feed each other in a positive direction, just as climate anxiety and inaction can feed each other in a negative one. That is a really useful reframe. It is not individual action or systemic change. It can be individual action and systemic change, and each can reinforce the other. I want to be honest about something for a moment. I try to make reasonably sustainable choices. I don't eat much meat, I use public transport, I try to buy less stuff, but I also fly occasionally. I sometimes buy things I probably do not need, and I am not perfect. And I have noticed that the perfectionism around this topic can actually be counterproductive.
The all-or-nothing trap.
Exactly. If someone feels that unless they are doing everything perfectly, they are hypocrites or failures, they are more likely to give up entirely than to make imperfect but real progress. Eco guilt becomes paralyzing rather than motivating.
There is a concept in psychology called moral licensing that is related to this. It is the tendency to feel that because you have done something good, you have earned the right to do something bad. Like, I recycled this week, so I can take this flight without guilt.
Which is not really how emissions work, obviously, but it shows how our brains can use even genuine good behavior as a kind of permission slip for other choices.
I think the healthiest approach, and the most sustainable one, ironically, is to aim for consistent, realistic progress, rather than moral perfection. Do what you can with what you have. Make the better choice when it is accessible and affordable, and do not beat yourself up when you fall short.
And maybe direct some of that energy outward. Write to your local representative about climate policy. Vote for parties with serious environmental commitments. Support businesses that are genuinely trying to reduce their impact. These are actions that scale in a way that your personal recycling habits never will.
Individual action as one tool in a much larger toolbox. Not the whole solution, but a real and meaningful part of it.
That is both reassuring and slightly uncomfortable at the same time.
Welcome to climate change. I want to end on something that I genuinely think does not get talked about enough in this conversation, which is the political dimension of individual action. Because I think the most high-leverage thing any individual can do about climate change is not actually about their diet or their car or their flights. It is about how they use their voice and their vote.
Say more about that?
Well, think about it this way. One person going vegan saves a certain amount of emissions over a lifetime. Real, but limited. But one person who campaigns actively, votes consistently for parties with serious climate policies, talks to their friends and family about why climate policy matters, writes to their representatives, and puts pressure on local businesses, that person's impact multiplies in a completely different way.
Because you are influencing the people and institutions that actually control the decisions that matter most. Energy policy, building regulations, transport infrastructure, agricultural subsidies, these are determined by governments, not by individual consumers.
Exactly. And I think one of the most damaging legacies of the carbon footprint framing we talked about earlier is that it has trained people to think about climate action in purely personal, consumption-based terms, when actually the most powerful thing you can do is be an engaged, informed citizen who puts climate at the center of their political choices.
Which requires a different kind of effort. It is not just about changing your habits quietly in private. It requires showing up, speaking up, and accepting that climate change is a political issue that needs political solutions.
And I know some people feel uncomfortable about that, the idea of becoming political about climate, but I would argue that the science is settled, and what remains is a political question about priorities and timelines. Treating it as somehow above politics has actually allowed a lot of inaction to continue.
So if you genuinely want to know what the most impactful individual action is, beyond diet and transport and consumption, it might be this: care enough to vote as if the future of the planet depends on it. Because in a very real sense, it does.
Well said. I could not have put it better.
Okay, and now we really want to hear from you. This is one of those topics where everyone has a perspective, and we think the comments section is genuinely going to be interesting today.
Question 1. What is one thing you already do, or that you have been thinking about doing, to reduce your environmental impact? We are not looking for perfect answers. Anything counts. Write it in English in the comments below.
And question 2, which we ask every episode because we genuinely mean it, what topics do you want us to cover next? Climate change, relationships, money, technology, health, healthcare, anything at all. Drop your suggestions in the comments. The best ones become real episodes, and this show is built around what you actually want to learn.
We read every single comment, and we really appreciate every one of you who takes the time to write something. And if this episode made you think, please share it with someone who might find it useful. It helps us grow and reach more learners.
See you in the next one. Thanks so much for listening today. Genuinely glad you joined us.
The glossary is in the description with all the key vocabulary from today. See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.